Fabulous. So here we are, Jessica and I.
It's an honor.
Jessica is looking smoking hot in her LaFleur skirt. And I am looking hot in my LaFleur dress. So thank you to our partners and friends over there for dressing us this morning. So Jessica, you're a total badass.
As are you.
No, you take the Badass Award on this stage.
Oh, well, thank you.
So tell us a little bit, the Feminist Fight Club. Tell us where this concept came from, why you wrote the book, what trauma is it in your past?
I know, it is. So the Feminist Fight Club is a real club of feminists, and it began about a decade ago here in New York City with a group of women. All of us were in pretty creative fields, producers, directors. I was a journalist just starting out, comics, and each of us were struggling to rise up in our respective white male-dominated workplaces. And so we decided to form a group to talk about our experiences and try to help and support one another. And in those days, a decade ago, the rules of the Fight Club were pretty simple. Number one, you didn't talk about the club outside of the club. Haha, Fight Club, that's where the name came from. And number two, we fought patriarchy, not each other. So we had to support one another. And, you know, it was funny to talk about how we didn't speak about it outside the group, but that existed for a real reason, which was that many of us did feel that if word got out that we were in this feminist group in our respective workplaces, we would be at best stigmatized, at worst penalized. And so we didn't talk about the group. But over time, we have gotten more comfortable speaking up, having courageous conversations, and so now the new rules of the Fight Club are you must talk about the club. And the book essentially is the story of my own Fight Club, but looks at the various ways that women still face all sorts of disparities and bias in the workplace and provides actionable tools for pushing back against them.
And there is a glimmer of hope today, right? We wake up this morning and Susan Fowler using her singular voice to talk about the issues at Uber. Everybody knew forever that Uber was a hyper-masculine, hyper-competitive place to work, which by that very nature meant it was an unfriendly place. I would say for women, but I'll actually say for people. Mm-hmm. And it was that singular voice that made a difference, just as Gretchen Carlson made a difference at Fox News. So there's a little glimmer of hope. Tell me how you think about that.
Yeah, I think that, what we're seeing is people feeling more comfortable speaking up. And whether they are individuals like Susan Fowler or whether they are groups, I think that women's voices are being listened to and heard in a way that they haven't in the past.
And shushed.
Well,
right?
And that's another subject.
When you've got Ariana Huffington
yes.
being talked over at an Uber all-hands meeting with a sexist joke, when the meeting's about getting rid of the sexism at Uber. Right?
But penalties.
And she's tough.
Penalties going along with it.
True.
And of course, Kamala Harris, which we all saw in the Senate Intelligence Committee hearing, repeatedly interrupted. And what we actually know, and I know that you have spoken about this a lot as well, is that women, in fact, are shushed and quieted more frequently than men. We are interrupted at twice the rate that men are, and more so if
it seems like a lot more than twice to me.
Well, maybe it depends on your workplace. And you, in fact, I think, were told at one point to sit down and shut up.
Sit down and shut up in the workplace.
Tell us that story.
Well, look, I was taking a controversial position at Citi in the downturn. We had missold products to our clients. We had thought they were low risk. They were high risk. And they were supposed to go down 8 cents on the dollar. They went down 100 during that terrible environment. And I went to my boss to say, look, we should partially reimburse the clients. And they kept saying no, and back and forth, and I'd bring another analysis of Not only is this ethical, but it's good business. Not only is this ethical, but it's good for the long-term business. Not only is it ethical, but it'll keep us from getting our pantsuit off. Not only is it ethical, right? I had 1,000 different, iterations of this. And finally, at one point, was told literally, sit down and shut up, which of course I did not. It ended up going to the board. The board sided with me. And of course, I was fired after. Boom, right on my what. So I guess it was a victory.
Well, one of the things I wanted to ask you, so the subject of this topic is courageous conversations. And you have been very vocal throughout your career. Has there ever been a time where you regretted speaking up?
Not really. Not really. I sort of have this view. So I didn't speak up when I was more junior. And I've written in my book, I would come in every day to my new job as a junior investment banker and have Xerox copies of male parts on my desk. I did not speak up. I didn't know how to speak up. I frankly didn't even know there was a thing as an HR department. It was just my boss, my boss's boss, boss's boss, all the guys through there. But it was a truly hostile work environment. I didn't speak up and I didn't quit. And here's what I think is a theme that sort of links all these. I couldn't afford to quit. Susan Fowler, Gretchen Carlson, myself later, not that I'm in the same group with those ladies, could afford to speak up, could get other jobs, were at other jobs, had the ability, therefore, to say, take this job and shove it. They also had something we didn't have in that day, which is super important, which is the amplification of social media. So that they were able to really get their voice out there. And for me, this issue of the power of our voices, having the financial wherewithal to weather a storm, money is power, right? The ability to speak up. These things are sort of, to me, just completely intertwined.
I agree, and I think that for me as a journalist, I've covered gender issues for a long time now, and one of my frustrations has always been that in journalism, you're not really focused on solutions, you're focused on the problems. And so I wanted to talk about solutions. And I wanted to have my voice heard because I had the privilege of doing so. And so I think that to the point of speaking up, but recognizing the reality that not everybody has the luxury of doing so, it's important for those of us with voice, those of us who are secure, to do so on behalf of our fellow women who may not.
So give us some pointers, right? From the Feminist Fight Club, what do you do to when you're getting interrupted? What do you do when you don't get the promotion? What do you do when you're with the dopey boss who doesn't get it? Give us some really actionable solutions.
So, there's a few things. Meeting dynamics are such a big part of this, and so that was one of the places where I began with this book and researching. So yes, we know women are twice as likely to be interrupted when they speak in meetings, and more if they are women of color. They are also more likely to have their ideas misattributed to men in the room.
Yeah, absolutely.
The one, like, the guy repeats what you just said, and then they're like, what? That's a great idea.
But he said it like this, right?
Yes. So, there are all of these things placed upon us, and there are also ways that I think we internalize a lot of this sexism. Feeling like we can't self-promote or we can't brag about our accomplishments because women are supposed to be modest and nice. And so how do you combat these things? Well, a lot of it, I think, has to do with camaraderie. If I see someone being interrupted, I draw the attention back to it and say, hey, can you let her finish? And by me interjecting or interrupting the manterrupter, as it were, then I look like a good colleague, you get to say your point, and everybody wins. There was a really fascinating piece in the Washington Post a few months back that I know you have mentioned before about the women of the Obama White House. And they felt, even in the Obama White House, this is a president who called himself a feminist, that they were not being heard. And their ideas were not coming to the fore. And so they initiated something called amplification, where they would invite one another to meetings, And what the research shows is that when there are more women in the room, we are more likely to be heard and listened to. And they would amplify what one another were saying. So they would sometimes repeat it and draw attention back to where the idea had come from. So a lot of this, I think, is looking out for one another, noticing these things. And if we know that these biases exist, we can actually call them out. I've created a lot of puns in this book. I spent a lot of time researching pun websites. And so there are these names for things like manterrupter, bro-appropriator, that's the bro who appropriates your idea. Mansplaining, I did not come up with. Rebecca Solnit, the novelist, came up with this. But I actually think these terms are really valuable, in addition to being a little bit funny, in the sense that they give you a language to call the behavior out. And I know you've written about the role of humor in calling out some of this behavior. Obviously, as women, we shouldn't have to be ha-ha funny when we're telling someone to get out of our face and stop interrupting us, but sometimes I think humor can actually be a pretty effective tool.
I think that I do too, and I do too since I said it. Excellent point. Excellent, outstanding point. I underscore her point. The challenge with all of this is, first of all, Sonia Perkins, who is a West Coast venture capitalist, a terrific investor, terrific individual, said to me not long ago something that I'm really sort of mulling over and over again, which is that if you look for gender discrimination, you will find it, and you will find it everywhere, and it will drag you down. And so I've really been thinking a lot about what of these subtle biases can you let go? And the one I sort of choose to let go is when the old dude, Jebediah, asks you to get him coffee. And to get upset like Jebediah and try to teach Jebediah a lesson, is a waste of your breath and a waste of time, and makes you sort of look to everybody else like a jerk to Jebediah because he's 87 and going to die soon. There's then the next level, right? The stuff that you don't want to let go by. And this is where I think we're talking, which is where women can come together if you've got a squad at work, and some of us have not, and if you've got the squad, work with each other, underscore each other, be there for each other. If you're alone, which I often was, because I was on Wall Street, which was a very male environment, gentle use of humor. And it doesn't have to be hilariously funny, but just something, rather than saying, would you stop interrupting me? Something that just sort of gently deflects. I remember one time I was I've told the story a bit, and it's not funny at all, but being in a big branch meeting at Merrill Lynch, huge meeting, and having one of the guys essentially raise his hand and say, what makes you qualified for this job? In a pretty challenging way. And I remember thinking, well, to be fair, I am his boss's boss. But if I act like a bitch right at this minute, everybody's going to blame me, because this is their friend who they've been in the branch with for probably 30, 40 years. How am I going to handle it? And it wasn't particularly funny, but I deflected by saying, oh my gosh, is this like a job interview? Do you want me to interview me? And it just let the temperature out of the room enough that everybody, okay. It actually gave me the opportunity to say why I thought I was qualified for the job. And people after, and at the end of the meeting, I sort of said, hey, do I get the job? And he's like, yes. And I had a lot of people come up to me and thank me afterwards. And what they saw that I didn't see right away is that he was being he was being protective of his company, and that they saw his heart being in the right place. Of course, I saw, like, you jerk, why are you trying to embarrass me?
You would never ask
right?
a man that.
Oh, not in a million years.
Right.
Not in a million years. But sadly, or whatever, society would have had me as the bitch if I had reacted. So I think about humor a lot. I think also about, I've written about this just this week, that, the way I used to also cope is I brought the research, the facts, and the numbers. And if you have the facts and the numbers, people want to listen to you. And I felt like after I did that, I could start to have my opinion heard. But it sort of sucks that we have to play these games,
It completely does. And that was a tension that I faced in writing this book was I don't actually want to have to provide this advice. And, things like negotiation. So when women negotiate, they're viewed as pushy. We hear all of this research about how women don't ask for more money, but then when they do, they're viewed as pushy and less likely to actually get the raise. So how do you combat that?
Well, how do you combat that?
Well, one bit of research out of Carnegie Mellon says that you should smile when you do the asking. So as anyone who...
terrific. Right.
I happen to have a case of resting bitch face. And as anyone who's walked down the street and been asked by a stranger why they're not smiling knows, we shouldn't have to smile. But at the end of the day, it's okay, well, I want the money, so am I going to literally grin and bear it and do it? And that was a lot of the tension that I faced here, was do I do the things that almost play into the gender stereotype in order to rise up and make the commitment that when I get there, I'm going to lift other women up so that they don't have to, or am I going to reject it altogether?
And therefore not get the raise, right?
Right.
So what do you say to people who say that the guys should really be doing more?
Well, I think they should.
Yes, and?
I mean, I am in a lot of rooms like this with a lot of women, and it's amazing.
We're convinced.
But yes, exactly. We are preaching to the choir here. I want to institute a BYOM rule at my talks, bring your own man, where every woman in attendance must bring a man. Because I think that, fighting for equality requires men to be part of this equation, and so we need them, in fact. And actually people listen to them a lot. Unfortunately, they still listen to them a lot. So we do need them even more. So I think that there is a responsibility on men as well, but I also think it's important to recognize, as you have often talked about, that women hold a lot of power.
Yeah. So look, here's the thing. I want men involved too. I will tell you that I have, given my years on Wall Street, may have interrupted more conversations of more men than any woman on the planet. Hey guys, oh hi Sallie. Hey, what y'all talking about? The power of gender diversity for driving business. Funny you should ask, right? That never happened. That never happened. Not one. And so I have come to the conclusion, while we need men, we can't wait for them. And so the courageous conversations that you talk about, the ones that I talk about, really remarkably similar. Are you willing to bring up the topics, whether it's in the town hall? Hello, CEO. Why do we only have one woman on our board? Hello, CEO. Why have the last 6 promotions to the executive level been all white guys? That's a courageous conversation. You may or may not be ready to have it. Another courageous conversation is, hey, Joe, you interrupted Susie 12 times, right? Or underscoring in the meeting. We do need to recognize that we do have enormous amounts of power, and there is something really interesting here, because there's so much talk about women being empowered, the empowerment of women. The definition of empowerment is to be given power. To be given power. Okay, all right. We do direct 80% of consumer spending, right? We do control $5 trillion of investable assets. We are more than half the workforce. We do have power. Susan Fowler started what happened at Uber, but I am absolutely certain that as they had fewer riders, right, and there was pressure that came from the outside, it was the economics of it that pressured them into taking action. And so the question is, how are we willing to use our power, be it our voice in the workforce, be it leaving a company that doesn't treat you well to go someplace else, whether it's leaving a company to start your own business. As I like to say, so the market can determine your success as opposed to some guy named Steve. Whether it's buying from companies whose values align with ours, investing in companies whose values align with ours, talking at the town hall.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think that banding together to have a voice, often when I thought about the issues of gender equality in my own workplace. And I began my career at Newsweek magazine, which was a place where in 1970, the women sued the company for gender discrimination. It was the first lawsuit of its kind. It paved the way for female journalists. I never knew this story. Nobody talked about it. When I started asking around, none of the editors knew. And so I had to sort of relearn this history on my own. And I was interested because I was facing a lot of the same things that they were. But what they did was they banded together and they spoke up. And because they were united in voice, they couldn't be penalized. So I think treating other women as allies, not enemies, is very important. And I think being able to take that step and actually speak up and have your voice heard.
And yet, so many people talk about how some women undercut other women, the queen bee who doesn't want to get any other women a senior. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, so I don't buy that. So if you think about this economically, the reason why women for so long have been kind of taught to compete against one another, at least when it comes to professional environments, is that there has been a tiny slice of the pie for them. So if here is the workplace, there's all these dudes, there's this tiny little slice for 2 women, then of course we're going to be elbowing each other in order to get that slot. But my feeling has always been if we can actually level the playing field, then competition won't need to exist disproportionately between women. And for what it's worth, like all of the talk about queen bee and mean girls, like all of this language we use and these buzzwords, a lot of it is not actually true. Like women are not necessarily more competitive with one another.
Although it happened to me.
I mean, it's happened to me as well.
To me.
But what the research in fact shows is that when women have conflict or when women have an issue, we perceive it differently than when men do. When men do, it's just like part of business. Like this is how things get done. And when we do, it's a cat fight.
Yeah. Well, okay. Hurt my feelings though.
Well, I think that's another place
This was this woman who said, I'm here for you, I'm going to mentor you. And I'm like, oh, that's going to be so amazing. I'm going to have this wonderful mentor. And then, the advice just that she kept giving me was sort of weird. And I thought, God, I'm so glad she's my mentor because, I wouldn't have thought to act like this. And then she was across the table from me when I got reorged out. And I'm like, oh. But here's the thing, I completely agree with you. And, as I become an entrepreneur, it is very much in my own interest, unselfishly, for more women to be successful because it grows the economy, it makes society better, it's good for our children, just makes the world better. It's good selfishly for me as well because as I think about fundraising, for example, venture capitalists are all about pattern recognition. And so if I'm the first woman to come through the door for them, and I have been, they does not compute, not a Stanford grad, not wearing a hoodie, not a young man, not Asian, doesn't code, nope, boop, out the door, right? But that is they see more women being funded and see the success because remember guys, the businesses that are run by, the startups that are run by diverse teams have substantially better performance than those that are run by men only. According to First Round Capital, 63% better returns. 63%. And so if the venture capitalists can invest in a few of those and start to see those better returns, and that's good for all the other women who come through the door.
And this is one of the things that I love about what you do and what you write in your book is that it is so reliant on data, and it is hard to argue with data. Like, as we talked about before, if you're a woman who gets emotional, you're suddenly hysterical. Like Kamala Harris told someone to stop interrupting her, and then she was called hysterical. Crazy. Exactly. But data is hard to argue with. And so I constantly am citing stats and printing out studies and literally putting things on people's desks who don't believe me to be like, hey, you don't need to trust me. Listen to Harvard Business Review. Listen to Sallie Krawcheck. And I think it works. There's this book from the 1970s that I was reading as I was researching mine called Sisterhood is Powerful by the writer Robin Morgan. And it's an anthology of essays about the women's movement. But there's this one chapter at the very beginning called Verbal Karate. And verbal karate is literally just a list of statistics about the state of gender equality or inequality at that time. And so I try to employ verbal karate as frequently as I can, and I think that that is one of the things that you do so well.
Well, right back at you. I love that you're saying research says. Very powerful. Okay, we're going to leave everybody with one action item. What's it going to be? What are they going to do differently when they go back to the office?
Form a feminist fight club. Yep. You know?
Yep.
Find a squad. Like, there is no downside to having other women and men, if you so choose, to back you up.
And I'll add to that, form the feminist squad, and then think real hard about what courageous conversation you and your squad are willing to have. Because guys, while we have been working hard and knowing our worth and leaning in and voting for a female president, diversity in corporate America has gone sideways. And I just saw research yesterday that said in terms of diversity in corporate boards, as of last year, we're going backwards. And so we need to do something different tomorrow than we did yesterday in order to move this ahead. We have a lot of power. We don't need to be empowered. We just need to use our power and do some things differently. You rock. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
What a pleasure.